With a successful flight of the Crew Dragon and the recent successful test of SN5, this is starting to look like a very, very antiquated way of getting people into space. The Soyuz family of rockets, and yes, I finally did it right this time, although the Proton was originally considered for moon missions, and by the way, may still come into use. You'll find out more about that later. Nevertheless, it does seem that Roscosmos has fallen hopelessly behind. Or have they? Almost as a direct response to these American triumphs, Roscosmos recently announced that it is pushing up its launch date for Luna 25 to October of 2021. Now, this lander is equipped with a number of instruments designed to examine the lunar regolith in detail, and also a number of other things, including an ESA experiment for lunar navigation. But it's the location, or rather the destination of this lander, that has me interested, and a whole lot of other people. As I'm sure most of you can guess, this lander is on its way to the lunar South Pole, a place where the United States and the Chinese are also interested in establishing a lunar base because of the probable presence of a substantial amount of water ice. Now, this lander is to be followed by a number of other spacecraft, such as Luna 26, which is to serve a number of functions, and polar orbiter that will, amongst other things, serve as a communications relay between Russian assets on the moon and Roscosmos. Now, all of this is working towards the creation of a Russian base on the lunar surface by 2030. Now, if this seems absolutely impossible, well, the Russians are not alone in this effort. They also have their own private startup company called Lin Industrial, which seems to have quite a few investors in Russia. But more importantly than that, they have international partners in this endeavor. Only last month, Dmitry Rogozin, who is the former deputy prime minister of Russia and now the head of Roscosmos, dismissed NASA's Artemis plans as, quote, a big political project. And given the nature of SLS, I can't say that he's entirely wrong. Instead, Rogozin spoke of discussions with Chinese officials and their intention to collaborate with China on building a lunar base, and Russia has their own plans on sending humans to the moon as well, with their new family of Soyuz rockets. The Soyuz 5, known as the Irtish now, and I may be butchering these names, is capable of hauling 18 metric tons to low Earth orbit. Not very much, but the Russians have considered it to be sufficient in order to assemble their next generation of crewed vessel, which is an upgraded version of the Soyuz, which is also called the Orel. Now, this vessel is tiny in comparison to the Orion, but then again, the Orion is an unnecessarily huge behemoth when we're talking about going to the moon. Now, if we're talking about building a base, obviously the Russians are going to need a much heavier launch capability, but the Irtish is actually going to be used as a central core for a heavy lift version of this rocket, which is going to have a capability comparable to that of the SLS. Now, given that the Russians are probably going to have a hell of a lot less overhead than the SLS, it's conceivable that they could get something like this completed more quickly and for a lot less cost than our comparable system. So, what do we do about this? Well, the obvious answer is the Starship. Reusable, capable of lifting enormous amounts of material and personnel to the moon, and for a much, much lower cost than anybody else can do it. The Starship offers a clear advantage to NASA and to the United States when it comes to establishing a permanent presence on the moon. But there has also been talk of using the Starship in a military capacity. Obviously, it could carry huge numbers of troops and material to various destinations on Earth and to the moon should things turn ugly between Russia and China and the United States. But What would a military-capable starship actually do to the prospects of future conflict in space, should that happen, God forbid, or the likelihood of a space conflict? Would it make it less likely? More likely? Well, we're going to delve into that and into what a space conflict might actually look like right now. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. You know, it's been a while since I've gotten really pissed off about something, but the current developments with what's going on with plans on the south pole of the moon, that has me pissed off, and I'll tell you why. It's following a pattern that's been in place for a very long time where major powers and their space agencies compete with each other over what happens to be in vogue at the time. When it was going to the moon, it was the Soviet Union and the United States competing until the United States got sick of it after winning the race. When it was getting a man into space, that was competition, and, the United States and the Soviet Union competed in that, and the Russians happened to win that one. When it was low Earth orbit, the Russians did build a space shuttle of their own. However, for the most part, their activities were restricted to space stations, and they did a fairly good job at that. But, again, it was low Earth orbit. That's where all the competition was. And once again, we seem to be moving towards that, with China also being a major competitor in this whole arena. And it just has me pissed off. It makes me wonder, why are we actually doing this? Why are all these nations getting involved and going after the same target? Commercial agencies would have their own agendas, but I believe that we just have the same old thing happening. So what concerns me is what happens if we have three competing bases on the south pole of the moon. If we have the Russians and the Chinese and the United States all with bases on the south pole. Are they going to play nice, like happens in Antarctica, where everyone just, pursues scientific study and that sort of thing and leaves each other alone? Or is it going to be something else? Because as I talked about in one of my episodes about Chinese ambitions on the south pole of the moon, there is a big strategic military advantage to being on the moon and having an established and sustainable presence there. And that's a big prize, and perhaps a prize worth fighting over. So what I'm going to deal with this evening is what happens if things do go south. How would we end up fighting in space? What would that look like? And also, what role would the Starship have to play? Because we've already been talking extensively, as far as the Space Force is concerned, about the possibility of a military-capable Starship. What role would it have, and what sort of impact would it have? So get ready for another unusual episode of The Angry Astronaut right now. So let's say these bases start taking shots at one another sometime in the future. What sort of military advantage would a combat starship offer? Well, it's pretty obvious. For a very low cost, the Starship can deliver several squads worth of soldiers, or 100 tons, or somewhere in that vicinity, of military equipment, weapons, pretty much anything that you would need to rapidly respond to a conflict situation on the moon. In addition, the Starship could also rapidly deploy a large number of armed satellites into lunar orbit, designed to take down the satellites of the enemy and quickly render them blind, giving the United States a tremendous advantage in such a conflict. However, a combat-capable Starship would not simply be restricted to lunar operations. It would offer a huge advantage on Earth as well. As most of us know, SpaceX has a plan of using the Starship for commercial flights from one side of the Earth to the other. This could easily be adapted for the deployment of troops from the United States or any other major military base to another location on the Earth's surface, someplace where there might be a hot spot of terrorist activity or some other political unrest. So, this gives the U.S. the ability to deliver military resources wherever they need them on the planet in about 30 minutes, just as passengers could be delivered by the same system in the same amount of time. A pretty big advantage and pretty useful, but at the same time also a big potential threat. A similar system could carry a hidden nuclear device inside its cargo bay and deliver that nuclear device directly onto Moscow without any warning. Now, if this sounds ridiculous to you, we have to take the Russian mentality into mind, because they thought the same thing might be done by the space shuttle. Once again, this may sound like paranoia, but the Russians have a long history of suffering tremendous casualties as a result of sneak attacks, all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century during the Russo-Japanese War, when the Japanese implemented a surprise attack similar to Pearl Harbor. Then, of course, there was the costly defeat in World War I, followed by the hideous casualties in World War II, which resulted in 24 million civilian and military deaths at best estimate, or more than 50 times as many dead as the United States suffered in the same conflict as a result of a surprise attack by Nazi Germany. Now, obviously, the United States cannot be expected to behave in the same way, but still, the Russians have a lot of reason to be extremely guarded against surprise attacks or any weapon system that could conceivably bring them about. Now, I spent a lot of my time at university studying Russian history, and I can tell you with an absolute certainty that if the United States comes up with a military system that gives us a clear strategic military advantage over the Russians, they are going to respond. So, let's have a look at how they might respond and how we might be able to defend against it. This is one of the few existing photographs of the R-23M space cannon, a weapon specifically designed for use in a vacuum off of a space station, specifically the Salyut 3 space station. This top-secret cannon proved to be quite devastating and was tested extensively, being effective out to a range of 1 to 2 miles and capable of penetrating quite a lot of armor, certainly the amount of armor that could possibly be put onto the Starship and still make it capable of launching out of Earth's gravity well. However, the cosmonauts determined that they would have to turn their entire station toward the target in order to make the cannon effective, in order to use the station's thrusters to compensate for the recoil generated by the weapon. Sort of cumbersome, but nevertheless, if you knew that your target was coming and had a lot of advance notice, and especially if it was in the process of slowing down as the Starship would need to decelerate as it approached the moon, it might make it quite a devastating weapon, capable, as I said, of ripping through the ship and anybody unfortunate enough to be in its way. However, as we all know, space is big. Really, really big. And in order to make a weapon with a 1 to 2 mile effective range work, you're going to need a whole network of satellites protecting your base in order to defend against all possible approach routes. However, such a weapon could also be used to defend the base itself from approaching troops. and that could also be extremely devastating. A weapon with that rate of fire, up to 5,000 rounds a minute, and also with that kind of penetrating capability, would be completely lethal in a vacuum environment. Quite a frightening prospect, especially considering that the weapon has already been designed, built, and tested, and who knows, it may still exist somewhere. Now, contrary to popular belief or what science fiction movies might tell you, lasers are less than effective, at least when it comes to offensive weapons. A laser does not destroy its target, at least most don't. Rather, it heats the target, its propellant, or its warhead, and destroys it, therefore making it effective to shoot down missiles or some sort of point defense weapon, but not very good for destroying enemy ships. Nevertheless, since it is extremely effective against missiles, this could be a very good weapon to equip the Starship with in order to defend itself against what would probably be one of the most common weapons in space, which of course would be good old-fashioned guided missiles, such as this S-500 series that the Russians are deploying right now, although this particular system of anti-aircraft missile, which might be adapted for space, has a range of several hundred kilometers, and if the Russians are to be believed, is capable of foiling stealth protection and other sorts of jamming systems. So in order to effectively defend itself, the Starship would probably be wise to employ point defense laser systems on top of various types of jamming equipment. Of course, a hit from a conventional missile on a ship even as large as the Starship would spell death for everybody aboard. It would either destroy or completely cripple the vessel, leaving it floating and helpless, and whatever crew had survived, suffocating in the darkness of space. Another weapon that could be used either by or against the Starship would be a kinetic penetrator and its related weapon, a railgun. This essentially uses an electromagnetic field to propel a projectile made out of tungsten or some other heavy metal, and to speeds as high as Mach 7, which would be sufficient to escape the moon's gravity, or it could be fired by a satellite. The Starship could also deploy a number of these satellites into lunar orbit to drop their ordnance down onto the lunar base. Now, it wouldn't be as devastating as similar weapons would be against targets on Earth because the moon's gravity isn't as great, but nevertheless, propelled by an electromagnetic force, it still would be sufficient to utterly destroy any lunar base and its occupants. Pretty terrifying. But perhaps the most terrifying weapon, at least as far as sci-fi type weapons are concerned, are particle beams, and fortunately we seem to be a long ways off from developing these. Essentially, it's accelerating a variety of different types of particles, or perhaps even hydrogen atoms, to relativistic speeds, and then they simply disrupt the molecular structure of whatever they hit. Experimental models of a particle beam suggest that they could deal as much as 1 gigajoule worth of damage to a concentrated spot on any target, essentially enough to destroy it within milliseconds. Now, of course, we can just be glad that we're a long ways away from developing this because the power requirements alone are enormous. But if we do go to war in space, we better be ready for one last consequence, and that is all the debris that's going to be generated by all of the ships or satellites that may be destroyed in our efforts to kill one another. The amount of debris and space junk that would be created by such a conflict in lunar orbit would make it just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, as flying around the Earth. Projectiles that would stay around for decades, being a threat to us long after the conflict was over. And so we really need to ask ourselves, is this the sort of thing that we really want to do or even prepare for? Or should it be something like any kind of war that we should do anything in our power to avoid? I'm going to conclude this episode with the story of Vasily Arkhipov. Most people have never heard of this guy, but nevertheless, it's because of him that we're all here. He pretty much saved the world, and I'll explain why. In 1945, as just about everybody knows, the United States dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. The Soviet Union, of course, regarded this as to being an unacceptable strategic advantage, and by 1949, they had their own nuclear bomb to everybody's shock. And that's because, as we discovered later on through documents after the fall of the Soviet Union, that they had agents infiltrated into the Manhattan Project. But in any event, a little over a decade later, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were at the brink of nuclear war. The tensions were high, and we had our fingers poised over the button. And a certain submarine close to Cuba came under attack from an American task force. They were dropping practice depth charges onto the sub, trying to force it to the surface. The Soviets, however, did not realize that these were practice depth charges. It's tough to tell the difference. And also, they went down so deep that they could not communicate with Moscow. So they had to make their own decision. And what the American task force didn't realize is that this submarine had a 10-kiloton tactical nuclear torpedo. And the officers on board the submarine had to make the decision as to whether or not to launch it. And both the captain and the political commissar on board chose to launch. But by sheer chance, Vasily Arkhipov, who was the commander of the Russian subfleet in the region, who just happened to be on board, he overrode their decision. His cool-headedness and his decision most probably saved the world from nuclear Armageddon. And we owe a great deal to this man. But in any event, the reason I bring that up is any time a major power gains a strategic advantage, usually the other country involved or countries are going to respond and respond quickly. Would the Starship represent, a combat Starship rather, represent a big strategic advantage? Yes, it absolutely would. Would it give us an edge in the future space combat? Absolutely. Could it be used for a lot of other purposes that has nothing to do with Russia? Yes, the quick deployment of troops and material to other parts of the world that are experiencing crises could save a lot of lives. So there's a lot of positives. Would it make the possibility of a space-based arms conflict, or rather an arms race in space is what I'm trying to say, would it make that more likely? Yes, I think that it would. I think the Russians and the Chinese would respond immediately to the creation of the first combat-capable spaceship that's ever been launched. I think that they would respond very quickly, and they would regard that as being a potential hostile act. And it could lead to a confrontation in space, and as you've seen from this episode, that sort of confrontation would be pretty ugly. So the question is it worth it? Military conflict leads to huge strategic leaps. I mean, World War II led to a lot of technological advances that wouldn't have happened had the war never occurred. But then again, it also came at a huge, hideous cost in human lives. As far as I'm concerned, it's not worth it. Now, if we see a clear and present danger to the United States developing in space, if we see that the Russians or the Chinese are doing something that could be a threat to us in space, should we respond and begin building a combat-capable Starship? Yes, I think we should respond to any potential threat. But should we be the first to build a combat-capable spacecraft? I say no. I say that it's not worth the risk. But that's just my opinion, and I'm interested to see all of your opinions, as I'm sure that this will generate a lot of talk in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and until we're on the moon and we're actually facing these tough decisions, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.